So over the years since I became a jazz musician and got interested in jazz, I was able to meet quite a few musicians who could recommend records for me to listen to. And I also was able to go to CD shops and record shops and find some jazz that was important for me. So I'd like to present for you 40 essential recordings in jazz released from 1957 to 1970. I really believe that this period is a golden era in jazz recordings, and you're going to listen to a lot of great recordings in this period, including hard bop, free jazz, post bop, and fusion. So these 40 recordings that I have presented are just a fraction of the thousands of recordings that came out during this period, but these are some of my favorites and they're certainly influential. So if you're someone who's new, just getting started to jazz, or you're someone who's more experienced and you want to check out some of the stuff that I had listened to, definitely check out this video. Many of these recordings are from the Blue Note label or recorded in the Rudy Van Gelder studios. The Stylings of Silver, pianist Horace Silver's recording, is quintessential hard bop. He features Art Farmer on trumpet, Hank Mobley on tenor sax, Teddy Kotick on bass, and Louis Hayes on drums. You can really tell that Horace Silver is an amazing composer, and I recommend you check out his recordings. Cannonball Adderley's Something Else, released in 1958, had an all-star lineup of Miles Davis on trumpet, Hank Jones on piano, Sam Jones on bass, and Art Blakey on drums. It is one of the few recordings after 1955 where Miles Davis appears as a sideman. Covering classics such as Love for Sale, Autumn Leaves, and Something Else, this recording features master soloing by all the musicians and is well worth your study. Cool Struttin' by Sonny Clark is probably one of my favorite recordings in jazz, and is truly one of the great hard bop records. Alongside Sonny Clark on piano is Paul Chambers on bass, Philly Joe Jones on drums, Jackie McLean on alto sax, and Art Farmer on trumpet. This record is one of the most swinging records out there, and due to the amazing rhythm section, the arrangements here are very unique. Blue Train features Lee Morgan on trumpet, Curtis Fuller on trombone, Kenny Drew on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, and Philly Joe Jones on drums. It is the same bass drum lineup as Cool Struttin', and you can really tell that these guys are among the most swinging musicians in the business. I particularly enjoy the standards Moment's Notice and Lazy Bird. John Coltrane is already at this point playing sheets of sound, and his mastery of the instrument is quite profound on this recording. Art Blakey's Moanin, released in 1958, is quite an amazing recording. Art Blakey is a powerhouse drummer. His legendary jazz messengers have had some of the greatest jazz musicians of all time. I wish I could include more recordings in my top 40 list of jazz from this time, but I feel that this recording is a really great representation of his band and playing. The sidemen on this recording are Lee Morgan on trumpet, Benny Golson on tenor saxophone, Bobby Timmons on piano, and Jamie Merritt on bass. I enjoy Moanin by Bobby Timmons and Along Came Betty by Benny Golson. Both of those guys are fantastic composers. Miles Davis's Kind of Blue in 1959 is a classic recording that features John Coltrane on saxophone, Wynton Kelly and Bill Evans on piano, and Paul Chambers on bass, and Jimmy Cobb on drums. The recording changed jazz for the foreseeable future, and Miles Davis introduced a modal sound that became a popular concept, and it inspired future generations in many different genres of music. Paul Chambers' beginning bass line in So What is classic, and Bill Evans' piano playing over Blue and Green is something fantastic. Jazz saxophonist Ornette Coleman is considered to be one of the players at the forefront of free jazz. This recording features Don Cherry on cornet, Charlie Haden on bass, and Billy Higgins on drums. Ornette introduces a new type of playing with less emphasis on intonation and technique and more on free jazz. I've listened to the recording and I just never really appreciated this type of jazz as much as I did straight ahead jazz and bebop. There were other detractors such as Miles Davis and Charles Mingus who didn't enjoy it either. In any matter, this is an essential recording in jazz and one to check out. Giant Steps featured John Coltrane, along with Paul Chambers, Wynton Kelly and Tommy Flanagan on piano, Art Taylor and Jimmy Cobb on drums. John Coltrane's recording revolutionized a new form of playing jazz. Saxophonist John Coltrane experimented with chord movements a major third apart, developing what would later become known as Coltrane changes. I particularly enjoy Giant Steps and Saida's Song Flute, and Naima on this recording. Bassist Charles Mingus is a talented composer, and it really shows on this recording. Most of the musicians on this recording are not well known, but still remain talented. I particularly remember this recording as one of the first major jazz records that I listened to frequently. Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, which was a tribute to the recent death of Lester Young, is a well-known jazz standard. And the track Fables of Faubus is well ahead of its times. Charles Mingus was standing up to the racist governor of Arkansas who was against integration. This was well ahead of its time in the civil rights movement, and Charles Mingus was at the forefront. There are so many Charles Mingus recordings out there, but I recommend you look at this one. It's really one of my favorites, so check out Charles Mingus. Tenor saxophonist Hank Mobley is truly one of the great hard bop saxophonists of the era, and had his own laid-back style. The recording features Wynton Kelly on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, and Art Blakey on drums. This I Dig of You has become a jazz standard. Blues and the Abstract Truth features some really amazing arrangements, and I particularly appreciate Stolen Moments, which was covered on many albums. The recording explores movements into the free jazz era, especially with Eric Dolphy. Cannonball Adderley's recording is one of my favorites. It's really swinging, and it features his brother Nat Adderley on cornet, Victor Feldman on piano, Sam Jones on bass, and Louis Hayes on drums. Every tune on this recording is enjoyable, and in the mid-80s bonus tracks were discovered, including one featuring Ron Carter on cello on the tune O.P. with Sam Jones on bass. Ron told me that he'd been playing in this group, which featured him on only one tune while they were on tour. Yusef Lateef's Eastern Sounds features Barry Harris on piano, Ernie Farrell on bass, and Lex Humphreys on drums. I included this recording because it's really pioneering that Yusef Lateef was fusing the sounds of jazz and Eastern music. He plays many different instruments on this recording. It's got a lot of swing, and it's a good introduction to Yusef Lateef. This live recording of Bill Evans at the Village Vanguard features bassist Scott LaFaro and Paul Motion on drums. It's largely considered to be one of the greatest live jazz recordings of all time. Bassist Scott LaFaro was a true virtuoso, and he only played the instrument for a short time, but really innovated. Unfortunately, he died 10 days after this recording in a car accident. I particularly enjoy Scott LaFaro's tune, Glorious Step. It's pretty hard to ignore that tenor saxophonist Dexter Gordon was really one of the titans of tenor saxophone. This recording features Sonny Clark on piano, Butch Warren on bass, and Billy Higgins on drums. Every tune is hardcore hard bop, and many players have looked up to this saxophone master. Pianist Oscar Peterson's trio, along with bassist Ray Brown and drummer Ed Thigpen, really features the virtuosity of the group members. I included this because of the master Oscar Peterson as well as Ray Brown and their contributions to the music. This recording really captures them in a great setting, and I highly recommend you check it out. Miles Davis was going through a real period of transitions on this recording and getting close to a point where he would have his second great quintet. In this recording, some of those band members have come to place. The recording features George Coleman on tenor sax, Victor Feldman and Herbie Hancock on piano, Frank Butler and Tony Williams on drums, and Ron Carter on bass. Miles Davis and his group are starting to move towards the period of post-bop, but haven't quite reached that point in this recording. I particularly enjoy 7 Steps to Heaven and Joshua on this record. Grant Green is really one of the greatest jazz guitarists, and he features Joe Henderson on tenor, Duke Pearson on piano, Bobby Hutcherson on vibraphone, and Bob Cranshaw on bass, and Al Harewood on drums. This is a quintessential hard bop recording. The title track, Idle Moments, is pretty fascinating, as the piece goes on for a long time and seems to slow down even if it's still swinging. Jean de Fleur is another great song on this recording. It's quite possible that Search for the New Land is one of my favorite recordings of all time. Lee Morgan's recording was made in 1964, but it wasn't released until 1966. The band included Wayne Shorter on tenor, Herbie Hancock on piano, Grant Green on guitar, and Reggie Workman on bass, and Billy Higgins on drums. Every track is great on this record, so it's really hard to choose one that particularly stands out, but I recommend you buy this and listen to it over and over. Tenor saxophonist Joe Henderson is a powerhouse player, and the title track Inner Urge has become a well-liked jazz standard. The band, which features McCoy Tyner on piano, Bob Cranshaw on bass, and Elvin Jones on drums, are all master musicians, and the recording is well received as one of the great recordings of the period. As previously mentioned in my other video, A Love Supreme is probably one of the greatest recordings of all time. Saxophonist John Coltrane is truly spiritual on this, and he's joined on this recording by McCoy Tyner and Jimmy Garrison, and Elvin Jones on drums. The core of this group is the familiar rhythm section of Miles Davis' great group, with Tony Williams on drums and Ron Carter on bass. In addition, there is the trumpet of Freddie Hubbard. One Finger Snap and Cantaloupe Island are 2 great jazz standards. Wayne Shorter's Speak No Evil is widely considered to be one of his greatest recordings, and it included Herbie Hancock on piano, Freddie Hubbard on trumpet, Ron Carter on bass, and Elvin Jones on drums. Bassist Ron Carter reminded me that the session was on a Christmas Eve, and he had fond memories of the occasion. I particularly enjoy this record and have listened to it countless times. The record was not released until 1966, but it is probably the best Wayne Shorter record you can buy from this time period. The recording Out to Lunch is Eric Dolphy's only recording made for Blue Note, but it is very popular among free jazz aficionados. If there was some free jazz that I recommend listening to, it would probably be on this recording. The recording features Freddie Hubbard on trumpet, Bobby Hutcherson on vibes, Richard Davis on bass, and Tony Williams on drums. Horace Silver's Song for My Father is one of the essential hard bop recordings of the time period. The title track has become a jazz standard, and there's some really great playing on here. The recording features a lot of different musicians, which I won't go into here, but this is a record to check out. JuJu is a pretty great Wayne Shorter recording. He doesn't always receive the fanfare that it should, but as any recording by Wayne Shorter is gold for this time period. On piano is McCoy Tyner, and on bass is Reggie Workman, and on drums is Elvin Jones. E.S.P. is the first major studio record of Miles Davis' second grade quintet, with Wayne Shorter on tenor sax, Herbie Hancock on piano, Ron Carter on bass, and Tony Williams on drums. Anything by this group is fascinating to listen to, and part of the post-bop canon, so I highly recommend you check this record out. At the same time of the height of Miles Davis' popularity in the 1960s, tenor saxophonist Joe Henderson was equally at the top of his game in recordings. In fact, the album featured bassist Ron Carter, Lee Morgan on trumpet, Curtis Fuller on trombone, Bobby Hutchinson on vibes, Cedar Walton on piano, and Joe on drums. Any song from this record is well worth studying and listening to in detail. Miles Smiles is the second studio release of Miles' second quintet, with the same personnel as previously mentioned. Miles Davis' recordings all warrant further study, but the explorations by this group are still exciting today, especially on this recording. Maiden Voyage is really a great album and one of my favorites. The record explores a lot of concepts including modal jazz, and it is one to play at night. Maiden Voyage and Dolphin Dance are jazz standards from this recording. Bassist Ron Carter, drummer Tony Williams are on this, as well as saxophonist George Coleman. This debut recording by Chick Corea is widely considered to be a masterpiece, and it features some of his great compositions. I particularly enjoyed Tones for Jones Bones. The record features Woody Shaw on trumpet, Joe Farrell on sax, Steve Swallow on bass, and Joe Chambers on drums. Forest Flower was recorded live in 1966 at the Monterey Jazz Festival, to much fanfare. The band included Keith Jarrett on piano, Cecil McBee on bass, and Jack DeJohnette on drums. The playing of the young Keith Jarrett here is pretty fantastic, and the whole band is fantastic. But definitely recommend you check this recording out and follow all of these musicians as they all became respectable band leaders in their own right. The Jody Grind, released by Horace Silver, is one of the great hard bop recordings of the 60s and features some really fantastic musicians. Highly recommend you check it out and follow anything really of Horace Silver. Antonio Carlos Jobim's recording Wave features some of the really great top-tier musicians exploring Brazilian jazz, including bassist Ron Carter. Both Wave and Triste have become standards in the songbook, and I highly recommend you check out the playing on this record. Miles Davis' Sorcerer features the same musicians of the second grade quintet, and there's some really high-end stuff to listen to here. Miles Davis' Nefertiti is another recording of the second grade quintet, and it explores post-bop. I particularly enjoy the tune Fall. It's the last purely acoustic recording of Miles Davis before he goes into electric music. The Real McCoy is really a jazz recording where Tyner comes into his own as a leader. Having previously played with John Coltrane, this recording, which features Joe Henderson on tenor sax, Ron Carter on bass, and Elvin Jones on drums, is really fantastic. Passion Dance and Search for the Peace and Blues on the Corner have all become jazz standards. I really enjoyed this recording, and I believe it's one that deserves to be listened to many times. Herbie Hancock's Speak Like a Child explores more harmony and it's really enjoyable to listen to. It features some of the top tier musicians of the time, including Ron Carter and Thad Jones. You can really enjoy the arrangements of Herbie Hancock, and this is a pretty great recording. The Gigolo features Wayne Shorter on saxophone, Harold Mabern on piano, Bob Cranshaw on bass, and Billy Higgins on drums. I particularly enjoy the arrangement of You Go to My Head, and Harold Mabern spoke to me about it in his interview, that it was really done on the spot. Miles Davis's Bridges Brew, which was recorded in 1969 and released in 1970, explored a new territory of jazz and helped found the genre of fusion. It featured a lot of incredible musicians, including Chick Corea, Dave Holland, and Jack DeJohnette, among others. It's a fairly popular recording even today. So thanks for checking out this video. I know I couldn't include everything in my 40 recordings, but I hope you found something interesting. Please subscribe to this channel, stay tuned, and I'll come out with more videos like this. Let me know if you liked it. Give a like button. Thank you.